The raging waters of the Sabine River crashed against Faith Collins' small homestead with the fury of 1,000 angry spirits, threatening to sweep away not just her home, but the life she had painstakingly built for herself after her husband's passing. She clung desperately to the trunk of an old oak tree, her knuckles white and her honey-blonde hair plastered to her face as she watched the cruel waters rise inch by inch, consuming everything she owned. Faith had known hardship before she was no stranger to the brutal realities of life in the West, but nothing had prepared her for the merciless flood that spring of 1875. The past winter had been unusually harsh, dumping unprecedented amounts of snow in the mountains. When the warm spring rains came early, melting the snow faster than anyone had anticipated, the result was catastrophic. From her precarious perch, Faith watched helplessly as the rising waters engulfed her small cabin. The vegetable garden she had tended so carefully was already gone, and the chicken coop had been one of the first casualties. The piercing cries of her livestock had fallen silent hours ago, and Faith couldn't bear to think about what that meant. "Please, Lord," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the roar of the floodwaters. "I don't know how much more I can take." She had been widowed just 18 months prior when Thomas Collins had been thrown from his horse during a cattle drive. At 26, Faith had been left to fend for herself on their modest homestead outside Desdemona, Texas. Through sheer determination and countless hours of backbreaking labor, she had managed not just to survive but to maintain the small farm, even expanding her garden and adding a few more chickens to her flock. Now, it was all gone. The waters continued to rise around her, and Faith realized with growing horror that her refuge might not remain safe for long. The massive oak tree had stood for generations, its roots digging deep into the Texas soil, but even it might not withstand the powerful current. Just as she was contemplating what to do next, a sound cut through the roar of the water, the distant whinny of a horse followed by a shout. Faith strained to see through the sheets of rain, hardly daring to hope for rescue. A dark silhouette emerged from the curtain of rain, a rider on horseback, navigating the treacherous terrain with remarkable skill. As he drew nearer, Faith could make out the broad-brimmed hat and the determined set of his shoulders. "Hold on, madam," the rider called out, his deep voice carrying over the storm. "I'm coming for you." Faith watched in awe as the stranger maneuvered his mount through the rising water, the powerful horse fighting against the current with each step. When he reached the base of the tree, the man looked up at her with piercing blue eyes that stood out against his tanned, weathered face. "Name's Virgil Reed," he said, extending a hand toward her. "Reckon you could use some help." Faith hesitated only briefly before taking his offered hand. His grip was firm and reassuring as he helped her down from her perch and onto his horse. "Faith Collins," she managed to say through chattering teeth. "I can't thank you enough, Mr. Reed." "Save your thanks for when we're on dry ground, Mrs. Collins," Virgil replied, urging his horse to turn around. "Hold tight to me now." Faith wrapped her arms around the cowboy's waist, feeling the solid warmth of him through his drenched clothes. As they rode away from her drowning homestead, she couldn't stop the tears that mingled with the raindrops on her face. "My home," she whispered brokenly. "Everything I had." "I know, madam," Virgil said, his voice gentle despite having to raise it above the storm. "But you're alive, and that's what matters now." They rode in silence after that, Virgil focusing on guiding his horse through the treacherous landscape while Faith clung to him, trying to process the magnitude of her loss. She had no idea where they were going, but anywhere was better than the flooded ruins of her life. After what seemed like hours, the terrain began to rise, and the floodwaters gradually receded. They were heading toward higher ground. Faith realized toward the rolling hills that marked the western edge of Desdemona. Finally, they approached a modest cabin nestled among a stand of pine trees. "It ain't much," Virgil said as he helped her dismount, "but it's dry and safe. You can stay here until we figure out what's next." Faith's legs nearly buckled beneath her as she touched solid ground. The reality of her situation hit her all at once. She was homeless, penniless, and at the mercy of a stranger's kindness. "I can't impose on you, Mr. Reed," she protested weakly, even as she allowed him to guide her toward the cabin. "Surely there's somewhere in town I could." "Town's not much better off," Virgil interrupted grimly. "The lower streets are flooded, and those that ain't are crowded with folks who have lost their homes. Trust me, Mrs. Collins, this is your best option right now." Too exhausted to argue further, Faith nodded and followed him into the cabin. It was sparsely furnished but clean and, most importantly, dry. A small fire crackled in the stone hearth, casting a warm, golden light throughout the single room. "I need to see to my horse," Virgil said, hanging his dripping hat on a peg by the door. "There are some dry clothes in that trunk, my sister's things. She stays here sometimes. They might be a bit large on you, but they're clean and dry. Get changed before you catch your death." Before Faith could thank him, he was gone, closing the door firmly behind him. Left alone, she stood dripping on the wooden floor, overwhelmed by the events of the day. Slowly, mechanically, she moved toward the trunk Virgil had indicated and opened it to find neatly folded women's clothing inside. She selected a simple cotton dress and undergarments, grateful for the chance to shed her sodden clothes. Once changed, she used a small towel to dry her hair as best she could, then moved to the fire to warm herself. When Virgil returned a short while later, he found her sitting on a rough-hewn stool before the hearth, staring into the flames with a vacant expression. "You should eat something," he said, hanging up his wet coat. "I've got some stew left from yesterday. It ain't fancy, but it's filling." Faith looked up at him, really seeing him clearly for the first time. Virgil Reed was tall and broad-shouldered, with the lean, muscular build of a man accustomed to hard work. His face was handsome in a rugged way, with strong features weathered by sun and wind. Dark brown hair curled at his collar, and those striking blue eyes regarded her with concern. "Why are you helping me, Mr. Reed?" she asked quietly. "You don't know me." Virgil busied himself with stoking the fire. "Out here we help folks in need. It's how we survive." He straightened up and met her gaze directly. "Besides, I know who you are, Mrs. Collins. Everyone in Desdemona knows about the widow who kept her husband's farm running on her own." There was respect in his voice, and something that might have been admiration. Faith felt her cheeks warm slightly, and she lowered her eyes. "Well, I'm not doing such a good job of it now, am I?" she said, unable to keep the bitterness from her voice. "You can't fight nature, madam," Virgil replied simply. "No one could have stopped that flood." While Virgil heated the stew, Faith watched him move efficiently around the small cabin. There was something comforting about his presence, solid and reassuring, like the hills that had sheltered them from the flood. They ate their simple meal in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. When they had finished, Faith insisted on washing the dishes, needing to do something useful with her hands. "You should take the bed," Virgil said, nodding toward the narrow cot against the far wall. "I'll make do by the fire." "I couldn't possibly, please, Mrs. Collins," he cut in gently. "You've been through enough today. Get some rest." Too exhausted to argue, Faith thanked him and retreated to the bed. She lay down fully clothed, pulling the rough wool blanket up to her chin. From her position, she could see Virgil settling himself on the floor near the hearth, using his saddle as a pillow. "Mr. Reed," she called softly. "Yes, madam, thank you for everything." He tipped his hat slightly in acknowledgement, and Faith closed her eyes, succumbing to the bone-deep weariness that had been threatening to overwhelm her since her rescue. She dreamed of rushing water and lost treasures, of her husband's face disappearing beneath the muddy torrent, and of a pair of steady blue eyes watching over her through the storm. Dawn broke clear and bright the next morning, a stark contrast to the previous day's chaos. Faith woke disoriented, momentarily confused by her unfamiliar surroundings. Reality crashed back quickly, however, and she sat up with a small gasp. Virgil was already up, she noticed, his makeshift bed cleared away. The cabin door stood open, allowing a fresh breeze to sweep through the small space, carrying with it the scent of pine and wet earth. Faith rose and smoothed down her borrowed dress as best she could, then stepped outside to find Virgil chopping wood. He paused when he saw her, leaning on the axe handle. "Morning, Mrs. Collins. There's coffee on the stove if you'd like some." "Thank you," she replied, self-consciously tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. "I was hoping. That is, I was wondering if we might go back to my homestead today. Just to see if anything can be salvaged." A shadow crossed Virgil's face. "I rode out at first light to take a look. The waters receded some, but—" He hesitated, clearly reluctant to deliver bad news. "There's not much left, madam. Your cabin's half collapsed, and what's standing is buried in mud up to the windowsills." Faith felt her knees weaken, and she reached out to steady herself against the doorframe. She had known, of course, but hearing it confirmed made the loss real in a way it hadn't been before. "I'd still like to see it," she said firmly. "I need to know for certain what's gone and what might be saved." Virgil studied her for a moment, then nodded. "We'll go after breakfast, but I'm warning you it won't be pretty." They ate a simple meal of cornbread and more of the previous night's stew, then set out on horseback toward Faith's homestead. The journey that had seemed endless during the storm took less than an hour in the clear morning light. As they crested the final hill, Faith gasped at the sight that greeted them. Virgil had not exaggerated. Her small cabin was in ruins, the roof partially caved in and the walls leaning drunkenly. The barn was completely gone, as was the chicken coop. Her carefully tended vegetable garden was now an unrecognizable mud pit. "Oh," she breathed, the single syllable laden with grief. Virgil remained silent, allowing her to absorb the reality of her loss. After a moment, Faith straightened her shoulders and nudged her borrowed horse forward. "Let's get closer," she said. "I want to see if anything can be salvaged." They picked their way carefully through the debris-strewn yard. Up close, the destruction was even more devastating. The floodwaters had carried away or destroyed almost everything Faith owned. She dismounted and waded through the ankle-deep mud to what remained of her cabin. Virgil followed, watching her with concern. "Be careful, Mrs. Collins. That structure's not stable." Faith nodded absently, her attention fixed on the interior of the cabin. Most of her furniture was ruined, covered in a thick layer of silt and debris. She moved cautiously through the wreckage, searching for anything that might be salvageable. In what had been her bedroom, Faith knelt beside a small wooden chest partially buried in mud. With trembling hands, she dug it out and tried to open it. The lock was jammed with silt, but Virgil appeared at her side with a small knife, which he used to pry it open. Inside, somewhat protected from the worst of the flooding, were a few precious items. A daguerreotype of her parents, her mother's silver hairbrush, a small leather-bound Bible, and a folded piece of paper that contained a lock of her husband's hair. "Thank God," Faith whispered, clutching these treasures to her chest. "At least I have these." They continued to search through the ruins, but there was little else worth salvaging. Faith's clothing was either gone or ruined beyond repair. Her cooking utensils were scattered across the property, many bent or broken. The tools she had used to work the land had vanished entirely. By midday, they had gathered what little could be saved the items from the wooden chest, a few metal pots, a cast iron skillet, and, miraculously, an undamaged quilt that had somehow been thrown into the upper branches of a tree. "What will I do now?" Faith asked, more to herself than to Virgil as they prepared to leave. "I have no home, no means to earn a living." Virgil was silent for a long moment, his expression thoughtful as he gazed over the ruined homestead. Finally, he turned to her. "This land is still yours, Mrs. Collins," he said. "And it's good land, despite what's happened here. You could rebuild." Faith laughed bitterly. "With what? I have no money, no materials, and no one to help me." She shook her head. "No, Mr. Reed, I think my time here is finished. Perhaps I should return to my parents in Missouri, though God knows how I'll afford the journey." "Or," Virgil said slowly, "you could stay, at least until you decide what you want to do." Faith looked at him in surprise. "Stay where? In Desdemona with me," Virgil clarified. "In my cabin, I mean, at least until you get back on your feet." He must have seen the alarm in her expression because he quickly added, "It would be proper. My sister Martha comes by most days to help with my accounts. I raise horses, you see. And there's a small storage room that could be made into a bedroom for you." Faith was speechless for a moment. The offer was incredibly generous, but accepting it would put her in a difficult position. A single woman living with an unmarried man, even with his sister's frequent presence, would invite gossip at best and scandal at worst. "I appreciate your kindness, Mr. Reed, truly I do," she began carefully, "but I couldn't impose on you like that. Besides, what would people say?" "People will always talk," Virgil replied with a dismissive wave of his hand. "But anyone who knows me knows I'm just trying to help a neighbor in need." He paused, then added more softly, "Please consider it, Mrs. Collins, at least for a few days until you can make other arrangements." Faith looked around at the ruins of her home once more. What choice did she really have? She had nowhere else to go, and no means to get there even if she did. "Very well," she said finally, "but only until I can find a more suitable arrangement. And I insist on working for my keep, cooking, cleaning, whatever needs doing." Virgil nodded, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Fair enough. Now let's get these things loaded up and head back before it gets dark." As they rode away from the devastated homestead, Faith couldn't help looking back one last time. Her life there had been hard but rewarding, and there was a finality in this departure that weighed heavily on her heart. "You know," Virgil said thoughtfully as they rode, "that land of yours sits pretty low, always has. But there's a rise about a quarter-mile west that never floods, even in the worst weather. Good spot for a cabin if you were of a mind to rebuild." Faith considered his words, allowing herself to imagine, just for a moment, the possibility of starting over. It seemed impossible now, but perhaps someday. "That's kind of you to mention, Mr. Reed," she replied, "but I think rebuilding is a dream for another time." Virgil said nothing more, but Faith caught the determined set of his jaw as they rode on toward his cabin, and the uncertain future that awaited her there. The next few days passed in a blur of activity as Faith adjusted to her new temporary living situation. True to his word, Virgil cleared out the small storage room adjoining the main cabin, moving his supplies to a lean-to behind the house to make space for her. It was a tiny room, barely large enough for a narrow cot and a small trunk for her few salvaged possessions, but it was clean and dry, and it offered her a measure of privacy. Virgil's sister, Martha Reed, appeared on the second day. A tall, no-nonsense woman of about 30 with the same striking blue eyes as her brother. Her initial reaction to finding Faith installed in her brother's home was one of surprise, followed quickly by sympathy when she heard the full story of the flood. "Well, you certainly can't go back there," Martha declared after Virgil explained Faith's situation. "And Virgil was right to offer you a place to stay. Though I imagine the good people of Desdemona are already wagging their tongues. That's why I was hoping you might stay here more often, Marty," Virgil said, using what was clearly a childhood nickname based on the scowl it produced on Martha's face. "Just until Mrs. Collins can sort out her next steps." Martha rolled her eyes at her brother but agreed readily enough. "I suppose I could bring my mending here instead of doing it at home," she conceded. "And I do need to help you with those horse breeding records. You've made a mess of them again, I expect." Virgil's horse breeding operation, Faith soon learned, was more substantial than she had initially assumed. He had a reputation throughout Texas, and even into neighboring states, for raising some of the finest quarter horses in the region. His current stock included 10 brood mares, 3 stallions, and various colts and fillies at different stages of training. "It started as a hobby," he explained somewhat sheepishly when Faith expressed admiration for the operation. "My pa was a cattle man through and through, but I always had a way with horses. When he passed 5 years back, I sold off most of the cattle and expanded the horse breeding instead." "It suits you," Faith observed, watching the gentle way he handled a spirited 2-year-old colt. "They trust you." Virgil ducked his head at the compliment, a faint color rising in his tanned cheeks. "Horses are straightforward creatures. Treat them right, they treat you right. Simpler than people that way." Faith found herself settling into a routine at the Reed Ranch. She took over most of the cooking and cleaning, grateful to have useful work to occupy her hands and mind. Virgil was an easy man to cook for, appreciative of even the simplest meals and always quick to thank her for her efforts. Martha came by most days, sometimes staying for several hours as she helped her brother organize his breeding records and correspondence with potential buyers. Her presence made Faith feel less self-conscious about living under Virgil's roof, though she couldn't help noticing the knowing looks Martha sometimes cast between her and Virgil when she thought neither of them was watching. One evening, about a week after the flood, Faith was sitting on the small porch of the cabin, watching the sunset paint the western sky in shades of gold and crimson. Virgil joined her, settling into a second chair with a quiet sigh. "Long day?" Faith asked, noting the weary set of his shoulders. "Had to chase down that fool yearling again, the bay with the white socks," he replied. "He keeps finding ways to escape the north pasture. I swear he's part mountain goat, the way he climbs." Faith smiled, having heard about this particular horse's antics before. "Perhaps he's just restless." "Looking for adventure. Or looking to drive me to an early grave," Virgil grumbled good-naturedly. They sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes, watching as the first stars began to appear in the deepening blue of the eastern sky. "I've been thinking," Virgil said finally, his tone casual though Faith sensed an undercurrent of tension. "About your land." Faith felt a pang at the mention of her ruined homestead. "What about it?" "Well, as I mentioned before, that rise to the west of your property would make a fine building site, high enough to stay dry even in the worst floods." He paused, then continued more hesitantly. "I was wondering if you'd given any more thought to rebuilding." Faith sighed, shaking her head. "It's a lovely thought, Mr. Reed, but as I said before, I have no means to rebuild. No money, no materials I could help," Virgil interrupted. "I've built before this cabin, the barn, the stables. I'm no master carpenter, but I know my way around a hammer and saw." Faith turned to look at him, surprised by the offer. "That's incredibly generous, but I couldn't possibly accept. You've done so much already." "It wouldn't be charity," Virgil said quickly. "More of a business arrangement." "What sort of business arrangement?" Faith asked. Her curiosity piqued despite her reservations. Virgil shifted in his seat, suddenly seeming uncomfortable. "Well, I've been wanting to expand my horse breeding operation. Your land would be perfect for a new pasture and perhaps a secondary stable. If you were amenable, we could work out a deal. I build you a new cabin on that rise, and in exchange, I get to use part of your land for my horses." Faith considered the proposal, turning it over in her mind. It was a generous offer, more than fair given her circumstances. And yet, "Why would you do this, Mr. Reed?" she asked softly. "You barely know me." Virgil was silent for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the distant horizon. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet but steady. "I know enough, Mrs. Collins. I know you're a woman of remarkable strength and courage. I know how hard you worked to keep your husband's farm going after his passing. And I know that if anyone deserves a second chance, it's you." Faith felt a warmth spread through her chest at his words, a feeling she hadn't experienced in a very long time. "Thank you," she whispered, blinking back unexpected tears. "That means more than I can say." They sat together as darkness fell completely, neither speaking but sharing a new understanding. When Faith finally rose to go inside, she paused beside Virgil's chair. "I think I would like to see this rise you keep mentioning," she said. "Perhaps tomorrow, if you have time." Virgil looked up at her, a slow smile spreading across his face. "I'll make time." True to his word, Virgil took Faith to see the rise the next morning. They rode out after breakfast, traveling along the edge of Virgil's property before crossing over onto what had been Faith's land. The destruction wrought by the flood was still evident everywhere they looked: uprooted trees, debris caught in branches, the mud-caked ruins of Faith's cabin. But as they continued westward, the land began to rise gradually until they reached a gentle slope that crested in a flat, open area. "Here," Virgil said, reining in his horse. "This is what I was talking about." Faith dismounted and walked a few paces, taking in the sight. It was beautiful, with a clear view in all directions. To the east, she could just make out the remains of her old homestead. To the north, Virgil's property stretched out, his cabin visible in the distance. The land here was drier, with stands of oak and pine providing natural windbreaks. "It is lovely," she admitted, turning slowly to take it all in. "And you say it never floods?" "Not in living memory," Virgil confirmed. "Old Joe Haskins, he's been in these parts nigh on 70 years, says this rise stayed dry even during the Great Flood of '33, when half the county was underwater." Faith nodded, trying to imagine a cabin near her cabin. It was a tempting vision. "And you would build it?" she asked, turning to face Virgil. "Just you?" "I'd have help," he replied. "There are plenty of folks in Desdemona who'd lend a hand. Many of them remember your husband kindly, and they respect what you've done since his passing." Faith was touched by this. She'd had little interaction with the townsfolk since Thomas's death, focusing all her energy on keeping the farm going. It was heartening to think they had noticed her efforts. "And in exchange, you'd use my land for your horses," she clarified. "Just the eastern portion," Virgil said. "It's good grazing land even with the flooding. Grass will grow back quick and it's close to the creek for water. You'd still have the western acres for whatever you wanted: crops, a garden, more livestock." It was a generous arrangement, Faith had to admit, perhaps too generous. "Why not just buy the land from me outright?" she asked. "It would be simpler." Virgil looked uncomfortable. "Would you sell it?" Faith considered the question. The land had been Thomas's dream, and after his death, keeping it had been her way of honoring his memory. Even now, with everything destroyed, the thought of selling it felt like a betrayal. "No," she admitted finally. "I don't think I could." Virgil nodded as if her answer confirmed something for him. "Then this seems the best solution. You keep your land, get a new home, and I get to expand my horse breeding. Everyone benefits." Put that way, it did sound reasonable. Still, Faith hesitated. "I would want to contribute more than just the use of my land," she said firmly. "I can work. I'm not afraid of hard labor. I could help with the horses, perhaps, or with keeping your records in order. Martha mentioned you were falling behind." A smile tugged at the corner of Virgil's mouth. "Martha talks too much," he said, but there was fondness in his tone. "But yes, if you're interested in helping with the horses, I wouldn't turn down an extra pair of hands. Some of the mares are due to foal soon, and it's always good to have someone else around during foaling season." "Then we have a deal, Mr. Reed," Faith said, extending her hand to him. Virgil took her hand in his grip firm but gentle. "Virgil," he said, "if we're to be neighbors and business partners, you might as well call me by my given name." Faith smiled, feeling a flutter of something unfamiliar in her chest. "Virgil," she repeated, "and you must call me Faith." Their hands remained clasped perhaps a moment longer than was strictly necessary before they both let go, a slight awkwardness falling between them. "Well," Virgil said, clearing his throat, "if we're going to build you a cabin, we should start planning. The spring rains aren't done yet, but if we can get the foundation laid and the frame up before the next heavy downpour, we'll be in good shape." They spent the next hour walking the site, with Virgil pointing out where the cabin might best be positioned to take advantage of the natural features of the land. Faith found herself caught up in his enthusiasm, beginning to believe that this wild plan might actually work. When they returned to Virgil's cabin that afternoon, they found Martha waiting for them, a concerned expression on her face. "Where have you two been?" she demanded as they dismounted. "I've been waiting for hours." "We rode out to Faith's land," Virgil explained, using Faith's given name naturally, which earned a raised eyebrow from his sister. "I showed her the rise where we're going to build her new cabin." Martha's eyebrows climbed even higher. Since when are you a builder, brother dear?" As Virgil outlined the plan, Martha's expression shifted from skepticism to thoughtful consideration. "It could work," she admitted finally, "and it would certainly address the issue of propriety more quickly than waiting for Faith to find other arrangements." Faith felt her cheeks warm at the implication. She knew Martha meant well, but the older woman had a directness that could be disconcerting. "I think it's a fine plan," Martha continued, warming to the idea, "and I'll help however I can. I'm handy with a needle. I could make curtains and quilts for the new place." "That would be lovely," Faith said sincerely. "I don't know how to thank you both for your kindness." "No need for thanks," Martha replied briskly. "That's how we do things out here. Now, who's hungry?" "I brought a chicken pie that needs eating." Over dinner, they discussed the plans for the cabin in more detail. Virgil sketched a rough layout on a piece of paper: a main room with a stone fireplace, a small bedroom, and a lean-to kitchen that could be expanded later if needed. "It won't be fancy," he cautioned, "but it will be solid and warm, and we can add to it over time." Faith studied the sketch, imagining herself living in this new home. It would be different from the cabin she had shared with Thomas Smaller at first, but designed with the possibility of growth. "A fresh start. It's perfect," she said, and meant it. The next day, Virgil rode into Desdemona to speak with some of the men about helping with the construction. Faith stayed behind, helping Martha sort through some of Virgil's breeding records. "He's hopeless with paperwork," Martha confided as they organized stacks of documents on the kitchen table. Brilliant with horses, but ask him to keep track of a simple bloodline and suddenly he's all thumbs. Faith smiled, already familiar with Virgil's preference for practical work over desk tasks. It's good that he has you to help him. Martha gave her a sidelong look. And now he has you as well, it seems. Faith busied herself with straightening a pile of papers, unsure how to respond. I'm just grateful for his help, she said finally. I don't know what I would have done otherwise. Martha hummed noncommittally. After a moment of silence, she spoke again, her tone more serious. My brother is a good man, Faith, the best I know, but he's been alone too long. Faith looked up, surprised by the change in conversation. What do you mean? Martha sighed, setting down the ledger she had been examining. Our mother died when we were young. Pa raised us as best he could, but he was a hard man, not given to showing affection. Virgil took after him in some ways, keeping his feelings close, focusing on work rather than people. When Pa died, Virgil just threw himself even more into the horse breeding, barely taking time to socialize. That doesn't sound so unusual for a man running a business on his own, Faith observed. Perhaps not, Martha conceded, but there's more to life than work, don't you think? He's 32 years old and has never even courted a woman properly, as far as I know. Too busy, he always says, or not interested. She fixed Faith with a meaningful look. Until now. Faith felt her cheeks flush. I don't know what you're implying, Martha, but Virgil and I have a business arrangement, nothing more. Martha's expression softened. I'm not implying anything, dear, just making an observation. I haven't seen my brother this animated in years. Whatever the nature of your arrangement, it seems to be good for him. She paused, then added gently, and perhaps for you as well. Before Faith could formulate a response, the sound of hoofbeats announced Virgil's return. The conversation shifted back to business matters, but Martha's words lingered in Faith's mind. Virgil returned with good news. Several men from town had agreed to help with the construction, including the local carpenter, a man named Harold Finch who had built half the structures in Desdemona. He says we can start as early as next week, if the weather holds, Virgil reported excitedly. And the sawmills agreed to extend credit for the lumber. I'll stand as guarantor until you're back on your feet. That's very generous of them, Faith said, touched by the community's willingness to help. And of you, Virgil. He waved away her thanks. Just good business. Harold's wife buys one of my horses last year, and the sawmill owner's been after me to sell him that black stallion for months. Martha snorted. Listen to him, making it sound like pure calculation when it's plain Christian charity. She turned to Faith. Don't let him fool you. He talked half the town into helping just by telling your story. People respect a woman who works as hard as you did after losing her husband. Faith was surprised by this. She had always viewed herself as somewhat of an outsider in Desdemona, keeping to herself and focusing on her farm. The idea that the townsfolk had noticed and respected her efforts was unexpected but gratifying. Well, whatever the reason, I'm grateful, she said. And I'll work alongside everyone. I may not know much about building, but I can learn. No one doubts that, Virgil said with a smile. Now, Harold suggested we start by clearing the site and laying the foundation. We'll need to haul stones from the creek bed for that. The next few days were a flurry of activity as they prepared for the construction to begin. Virgil and Faith rode out to the building site each morning to clear brush, mark boundaries, and plan the exact placement of the cabin. It was hard physical work, but Faith welcomed it, finding satisfaction in the tangible progress they made each day. Working alongside Virgil, she began to see new facets of his character. He was patient, never rushing or becoming frustrated when a task took longer than expected. He was also surprisingly meticulous, insisting on doing things properly even when a quicker, less thorough approach might have sufficed. "A house is only as good as its foundation," he told her as they carefully marked out the perimeter of the cabin with stakes and string. "Get that right, and the rest will follow." Faith found herself appreciating not just his knowledge and skill, but his company as well. Virgil was a man of few words, but when he did speak, it was often with a dry wit that caught her by surprise. She found herself laughing more in those few days than she had in the long months since Thomas's death. On Sunday, they attended church in Desdemona together, along with Martha. Faith was somewhat apprehensive about facing the townsfolk, aware that her living arrangement with Virgil, however temporary and innocent, might have sparked gossip. To her relief, the reception was uniformly warm. Women who had barely acknowledged her in the past now approached with offers of household items for her new cabin curtains, dishware, preserved foods to stock her pantry. The men nodded respectfully to her and clapped Virgil on the back, many confirming their willingness to help with the building. "Told you people would want to help," Virgil murmured as they made their way through the churchyard after the service, nodding to yet another well-wisher. "I never expected such generosity," Faith admitted. "I've always kept to myself so much." "Folks respect hard work and resilience," Virgil replied, "and they admire a woman who faced adversity without complaint. Besides," he added with a hint of a smile, "most of them are probably just glad to see me socializing for once, as Martha would say." Faith glanced at him, catching the rare teasing light in his blue eyes. "Are you such a hermit, then?" "According to my sister, I'm practically a wild man of the woods," he said, his tone mock serious. "Barely civilized." Faith couldn't help the laugh that bubbled up. "Well, you've hidden it remarkably well. I haven't seen you growling or howling at the moon even once." Virgil's answering laugh drew glances from several nearby churchgoers, including Martha, who raised an eyebrow in their direction. "See what you've done," Virgil murmured. "Now they'll really talk." Faith should have felt embarrassed, but instead she found herself smiling back at him, a warm contentment spreading through her. For the first time since the flood, perhaps even longer, she felt a sense of belonging, of community. And standing beside Virgil Reed, with his steady presence and unexpected humor, she felt something else too, something she wasn't quite ready to name. Construction on Faith's new cabin began in earnest the following Tuesday. True to their word, several men from town arrived at the building site early in the morning, tools in hand and ready to work. Harold Finch, the carpenter, took charge of the proceedings, directing the initial layout and foundation work with a practiced eye. Faith was initially concerned that the men might object to her presence at the building site, or worse, to her desire to work alongside them. To her relief, they accepted her participation without comment, Harold even taking the time to explain various techniques and teach her basic carpentry skills. "Every person should know how to maintain their own home," he told her as he demonstrated how to properly drive a nail without splitting the wood. "Man or woman makes no difference." Virgil, she noticed, seemed pleased by her involvement, often seeking her opinion on decisions about the cabin's design or layout. It was her home, after all, and he wanted her to be satisfied with the result. The work was hard but rewarding. By the end of the first week, the stone foundation was complete, and they had begun framing the walls. Faith's muscles ached from the unaccustomed labor, but she fell into bed each night with a sense of accomplishment that outweighed the discomfort. One evening, as they rode back to Virgil's cabin after a particularly productive day, Faith found herself studying his profile against the setting sun. There was a smudge of dirt on his cheek and sawdust in his hair, but he looked content, relaxed in a way she hadn't seen before. "Thank you," she said suddenly. Virgil glanced over at her, raising an eyebrow. "For what?" "For all of this." Faith gestured vaguely back toward the construction site. "For helping me rebuild. For giving me a chance to start over." A shadow passed over Virgil's face. "No need to thank me. Any decent person would have done the same." "No," Faith shook her head firmly. "Not any person would have done this much. Most would have offered sympathy, perhaps a temporary place to stay, but not all of this. You've given me back my future, Virgil." Virgil was quiet for a long moment, his eyes fixed on the trail ahead. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and thoughtful. "Maybe I understand something about needing to start over." Faith waited, sensing there was more he wanted to say. After another pause, he continued. "When my pa died, I was lost. The cattle ranch was his dream, not mine, but it was all I knew. Selling off most of the herd and focusing on the horses instead, that was my fresh start. My chance to build something that was truly mine." He glanced at her, a hint of vulnerability in his usually composed expression. "Everyone deserves that chance, Faith." The simple sincerity in his voice touched her deeply. Impulsively, she reached across the space between their horses and placed her hand on his arm. "Well, I'm grateful all the same." Virgil looked down at her hand, then back up to meet her eyes. Something unspoken passed between them, a current of understanding and perhaps something more. Then he smiled, a genuine smile that transformed his features and made Faith's heart skip a beat. "You're welcome," he said softly. They rode the rest of the way in companionable silence, but Faith was acutely aware of a shift in their relationship. The respect and gratitude she felt for Virgil had been joined by a warmer, more complex emotion, one that both excited and frightened her. As the days passed and work on the cabin progressed, Faith found herself increasingly drawn to Virgil. She noticed small things about him, the way he absently hummed under his breath when focused on a task, the gentle way he handled even the most spirited horses, the quiet authority he commanded without ever raising his voice. She also became aware of his noticing her. She would look up from her work to find his eyes on her, a thoughtful expression on his face that quickly changed to a smile or a nod when their gazes met. Sometimes their hands would brush as they worked side by side, and the brief contact would send a warmth spreading through her that had nothing to do with the Texas sun. Martha, observant as ever, seemed to note these developments with a barely concealed satisfaction. She made a point of inviting Faith to join her for tea one afternoon while Virgil was in town on business. "The cabin's coming along beautifully," Martha commented as they sat at the kitchen table, cups of steaming tea before them. "Another few weeks, and you'll be able to move in." "Yes," Faith agreed, surprising herself with the hint of reluctance she felt at the prospect. She had grown accustomed to the comfortable routine she had established with Virgil and Martha, to the point where the thought of living alone again seemed somehow daunting. "You'll be close enough to visit often, of course," Martha continued, watching Faith's face carefully. "And I imagine Virgil will find all sorts of reasons to ride over and check on you." Faith felt her cheeks warm. "He's been very kind." "Kind," Martha repeated with a small smile. "Yes, my brother is certainly that. But his interest in you goes beyond mere kindness, Faith. Surely you've noticed." Faith's blush deepened. "Martha, I don't think—" "Oh, don't worry," Martha interrupted gently. "I'm not trying to embarrass you or push you into anything. I just thought it might help to know that what you're feeling isn't one-sided." Faith stared down at her tea, unsure how to respond. Was it that obvious, then, this attraction she felt toward Virgil? And was Martha right? Did he truly feel the same? "It's too soon," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "Thomas has been gone less than 2 years, and I wasn't looking for this. Martha reached across the table to cover Faith's hand with her own. The heart doesn't always consult our plans or our sense of proper timing, she said kindly. And grieving doesn't mean you stop living, Faith. Thomas wouldn't have wanted that for you. Faith knew Martha was right. Thomas had been a loving husband who had always wanted her happiness above all else. If he could see her now, he would likely encourage her to open her heart to the possibility of new love. But it wasn't just her lingering sense of loyalty to Thomas that gave her pause. There was also fear of being vulnerable again, of loving someone and potentially losing them. The pain of Thomas's death had nearly broken her. Could she risk facing such grief again? I'm not saying you need to make any decisions now, Martha said, seeming to sense Faith's internal struggle. Just be honest with yourself about what you're feeling. And know that my brother, for all his strengths, can be remarkably dense when it comes to matters of the heart. If you do come to care for him, you might need to be the one to make the first move. Faith looked up, startled. Surely not, Martha laughed. You don't know Virgil as I do. He'd rather face a stampeding herd than admit to having feelings for a woman. He's probably telling himself that his interest in you is purely neighborly, even as he finds excuses to be near you every waking moment. The thought was both amusing and oddly comforting. Faith had assumed Virgil's natural reserve meant he was more experienced and composed in matters of the heart than she was. The idea that he might be just as uncertain, just as hesitant, made her own feelings seem less overwhelming. Thank you, Martha, she said sincerely. For the tea and for everything else. Martha squeezed her hand once more before letting go. That's what family is for, dear. Family. The word resonated with Faith, reminding her of all she had lost, not just Thomas, but the possibility of the family they had hoped to build together. Could she find that again with Virgil? Was that even what he wanted? These questions lingered in her mind as she continued to work alongside Virgil in the following days. She found herself watching him more closely, looking for signs of the feelings Martha had suggested. Sometimes, she thought she saw them in the way his eyes softened when they rested on her, in his eagerness to show her new aspects of his horse breeding operation, in the care he took to ensure her new cabin would be comfortable and suited to her needs. But he made no declarations, no obvious overtures, and Faith, despite Martha's advice, found herself equally hesitant to reveal her growing feelings. The turning point came unexpectedly, nearly 3 weeks after construction on the cabin had begun. The walls were up, the roof was on, and they were working on the interior, installing the stone fireplace that would be the heart of the small home. Faith was arranging stones in the fireplace base while Virgil mixed mortar nearby. They were alone for once. The men from town had other commitments that day, and Martha was visiting a friend in Desdemona. "Hand me that flat stone, would you?" Faith asked, pointing to a suitable piece near Virgil's feet. As he passed it to her, their fingers brushed, and Faith felt the now familiar warmth spread through her at the contact. But this time, instead of quickly withdrawing his hand, Virgil let his fingers linger against hers for a moment longer than necessary. Faith looked up, meeting his gaze. There was an intensity in his blue eyes that made her breath catch. "Faith," he began, his voice low and a touch uncertain, "I've been meaning to ask you something." Her heart hammered in her chest. "Yes." Before Virgil could continue, a shout from outside interrupted them. "Hello, anyone home?" The moment broken, Virgil stepped back, a flash of frustration crossing his face before he composed himself. "In here," he called. A moment later, Harold Finch appeared in the doorway, followed by his son Jacob. "Thought we'd stop by on our way back from the Jenkins place," Harold explained. "See if you needed any help with that fireplace." "That's kind of you," Faith said, fighting to keep the disappointment from her voice. We're just getting started, actually." The rest of the day passed in productive work, but the interrupted moment between Faith and Virgil wasn't recaptured. He seemed more reserved than usual, focusing intently on the task at hand and speaking only when necessary. As they prepared to leave at day's end, Faith found herself lingering, hoping Virgil might return to whatever he had been about to say earlier. But he was already loading tools into the wagon, his movements brisk and efficient. "Ready to head back?" he asked, not quite meeting her eyes. Faith nodded, resigning herself to the missed opportunity. "Yes, I'm ready." The ride back to Virgil's cabin was quieter than usual, a slight tension hanging in the air between them. Faith searched for something to say that might ease the awkwardness, but before she could find the right words, Virgil broke the silence. "I've been thinking," he said, his tone carefully neutral. "The cabin will be habitable by the end of next week, most likely. Not finished completely, there will still be details to attend to, but you could move in if you wanted." "Oh," Faith said, surprised by the abrupt introduction of the topic. That's wonderful news," Virgil nodded, his eyes fixed on the trail ahead. "I thought you'd be pleased. I know you must be eager to have your own space again." Was that hurt she detected in his voice? Faith studied his profile, trying to decipher his mood. "I've been very comfortable in your home, Virgil," she said carefully. "You and Martha have made me feel welcome." "Good," he replied, his tone softening slightly. "That's good. But still, your own home will be better. Independence is important." Faith wasn't sure how to respond. Did he want her to leave? Had she misinterpreted his feelings, or was this his way of maintaining a proper distance between them? Before she could formulate a reply, Virgil continued, his words coming more rapidly now. "Of course, I'll still be around to help with anything you need. And the arrangement regarding the pasture island for my horses stands. We'll be neighbors after all. Good neighbors." "Yes," Faith agreed quietly. "Good neighbors." They lapsed into silence again, and Faith felt a heaviness in her chest. Perhaps Martha had been wrong about Virgil's feelings. Or perhaps he had reconsidered, decided that involvement with her would complicate his life unnecessarily. That night, after a subdued dinner during which Martha cast curious glances between them, Faith retired early to her small room. She lay awake for hours, replaying the day's events in her mind and wondering what might have been if they hadn't been interrupted. Just before dawn, she was awakened by the sound of rain, not the gentle patter of a spring shower, but the heavy drumming of a downpour. She rose quickly and moved to the main room, where she found Virgil already dressed and pulling on his rain slicker. "Morning," he said, nodding to her. "Quite a storm brewing." "Yes," Faith agreed, moving to the window to peer out at the gray deluge. "Will it affect the work on the cabin today?" "Most likely," Virgil replied, settling his hat firmly on his head. "Can't do much interior work with the rain coming in through the unfinished windows, but I'm heading out to check on the horses first. Some of the younger ones get spooked by storms." "I'll come with you," Faith said impulsively. "Just let me get my coat." Virgil looked like he might protest, but then nodded. "Hurry then. I want to check the north pasture before this gets any worse." Minutes later, they were on horseback, riding through the rain toward the pasture where Virgil kept his youngest horses. The rain beat down mercilessly, soaking them despite their protective gear. Thunder rolled overhead, and Faith's horse pranced nervously beneath her. "Not much further," Virgil called over his shoulder, raising his voice to be heard above the storm. They reached the pasture to find the young horses huddled together beneath a stand of trees, clearly agitated by the weather. Virgil dismounted quickly and approached them, speaking in low, soothing tones. Faith followed his lead, helping to calm the nervous animals. "They seem all right," Virgil said after checking each horse for signs of injury or distress. but I'd feel better getting them into the stable until this passes. Help me herd them toward the gate." Working together, they managed to guide the small herd toward the pasture gate. As they were securing it behind the last horse, a tremendous crack of thunder directly overhead sent Faith's mount rearing in panic. Faith, caught off guard, lost her grip on the reins and was thrown backwards, landing hard on the muddy ground. "Faith!" Virgil was at her side instantly, his face a mask of concern. "Are you hurt?" Faith sat up gingerly, wincing as pain shot through her right ankle. "I think I've twisted my ankle, but otherwise I'm fine." Virgil knelt beside her in the mud, his hands gentle as he examined her ankle through her boot. "Can you move it?" he asked. Faith tried, gasping at the sharp pain. "A little, but it hurts quite a bit." Without hesitation, Virgil scooped her up in his arms. "I'm taking you back to the cabin," he said firmly. "Martha will know what to do for that ankle, but the horses," Faith began. "The horses can wait," Virgil interrupted. "They're headed for the stable anyway. Your health is more important." Faith found herself cradled against Virgil's chest as he carried her to his horse. Despite the pain in her ankle, she was intensely aware of his strength, of the security she felt in his arms. He lifted her onto his horse with surprising ease, then mounted behind her, one arm securely around her waist as he took the reins with his other hand. "Hold tight," he instructed, and Faith leaned back against him, grateful for his solid presence as they made their way through the storm. By the time they reached the cabin, Faith was shivering from the cold and wet, and her ankle had swollen considerably. Martha, who had arrived earlier that morning, exclaimed in alarm when they entered. "Good heavens, what happened?" "Faith fell from her horse," Virgil explained as he carefully set Faith down on a chair. "I think she sprained her ankle." Martha immediately took charge, helping Faith out of her wet clothes and into dry ones, then examining the injured ankle with practiced hands. "A bad sprain, I think, but not broken," she pronounced. "We'll need to wrap it tightly and keep it elevated." "And you'll need to stay off it for at least a few days," Faith groaned. "But the cabin, there's still so much to do." "The cabin can wait," Virgil said firmly from where he stood by the fire, having changed into dry clothes himself. "Your recovery is more important." Martha shot her brother a knowing look before turning back to Faith. "He's right. Besides, this rain will delay work anyway. Now, let me find some bandages for that ankle." While Martha rummaged through a trunk for medical supplies, Virgil approached Faith, crouching beside her chair so they were at eye level. "You gave me quite a scare," he said quietly, "when I saw you fall." Faith was struck by the naked emotion in his eyes. Concern, yes, but also something deeper, more profound. "I'm sorry," she replied. "I should have been more careful." Virgil shook his head. "It wasn't your fault. Nature reminds us of our limitations sometimes." He paused, then added more softly, "I couldn't bear it if anything happened to you, Faith." Before she could respond, Martha returned with bandages and a bottle of witch hazel. Virgil moved aside to let his sister tend to Faith's injury, but his words lingered in Faith's mind, warming her despite the chill of her wet clothes. The next few days passed slowly for Faith, confined as she was to Virgil's cabin with strict instructions to keep weight off her injured ankle. Martha brought her books to read and kept her company during the day, while Virgil continued to check on the progress at the cabin site whenever the rain allowed. On the third day after her accident, the storm finally broke, giving way to clear skies and the fresh, clean scent of washed earth. Faith sat on the cabin's small porch, her bandaged ankle propped up on a stool, enjoying the warm sunshine and the gentle breeze. Virgil had ridden out early to assess any damage the storm might have caused to the new cabin, and Faith found herself watching anxiously for his return. She had been doing a lot of thinking during her enforced rest, about her feelings for Virgil and about the future she wanted. When she finally spotted him riding toward the cabin, her heart quickened. He dismounted and approached the porch, his expression unreadable. "How's the ankle today?" he asked, settling into the chair beside her. "Much better," Faith replied. "Martha says I can start putting some weight on it tomorrow, though I should still be careful." Virgil nodded, seeming distracted. "That's good news." "How is the cabin?" Faith asked, noting his pensive mood. "Was there much damage from the storm?" "No, it held up well," Virgil said. "The roof kept out most of the rain and the foundation is solid. There's mud everywhere, of course, but that will dry." "That's a relief," Faith said. When Virgil remained silent, she added, "Is something wrong, Virgil? You seem preoccupied." He was quiet for so long that Faith thought he might not answer. Finally, he turned to face her, his blue eyes serious. "The other day, before Harold and his son arrived," he began, "I was about to ask you something important. Something I've been thinking about for a while now." Faith's pulse quickened. "Yes, I remember." Virgil took a deep breath, as if gathering his courage. "Faith, I know this might seem sudden or perhaps inappropriate given how recently you lost your husband. But these past weeks, working alongside you, getting to know you, I've come to care for you deeply." Faith felt a surge of emotion so strong it nearly took her breath away. "Virgil, please let me finish," he said gently. "I'm not asking for anything right now. I just wanted you to know how I feel, and to tell you that, when you're ready, if you're ever ready, I would be honored if you would consider a future together." The sincerity in his voice, the vulnerability in his usually composed expression, touched Faith profoundly. Without thinking, she reached out to take his hand. "Virgil Reed," she said softly, "I have come to care for you too, more than I thought possible, more than I was prepared for." Hope flared in his eyes. "Truly?" Faith nodded, smiling through the tears that had suddenly welled up. "Truly. These past weeks have been a gift, not just because you rescued me from the flood and helped me rebuild, but because being with you, knowing you, has helped me find joy again when I thought it was lost to me forever." Virgil's hand tightened around hers. "I never expected this," he admitted. "When I found you that day, clinging to that tree with the flood rising all around, all I wanted was to get you to safety. I didn't know then that you would come to mean so much to me." "Life has a way of surprising us," Faith replied. "Sometimes with tragedy like the flood, but sometimes with unexpected blessings." She paused, then added more seriously, "But Virgil, I need you to understand something. I love Thomas. A part of me always will, if we were two. To build a life together, I wouldn't want you to feel you were competing with a ghost." Virgil's expression softened. "I would never ask you to forget him or to stop loving him," he said. "The heart is capable of great expansion, Faith. Your love for Thomas is part of who you are, and I honor that." His understanding, his acceptance of her past, moved Faith deeply. Impulsively, she leaned forward and pressed her lips gently to his. The kiss was brief, tender, a promise rather than a passion. When they drew apart, Virgil's eyes were wide with surprise, then warm with affection. "I've been wanting to do that for a while now," Faith confessed, a blush coloring her cheeks. Virgil smiled, the slow, genuine smile that transformed his usually serious countenance. "I've been wanting you to," he admitted. Then more soberly, "Faith, I don't want to rush you. We can take this slowly, at whatever pace feels right to you." Faith nodded, grateful for his sensitivity. "I think that would be best. But Virgil, I want you to know that I'm not uncertain about my feelings for you, just about the timing of it all." "I understand," he assured her. "And I'll wait as long as needed. Some things are worth waiting for." The look he gave her then, full of tenderness and promise, made Faith's heart swell with emotion. In that moment, despite all she had lost, she felt incredibly fortunate. The flood had swept away her home and possessions, but it had also swept her into the path of this remarkable man who was offering her not just shelter, but a chance at new love, new happiness. The weeks that followed were filled with both hard work and growing joy. With Faith's ankle healing, she was able to return to helping with the cabin construction, though both Martha and Virgil insisted she take frequent breaks and avoid any heavy lifting. The relationship between Faith and Virgil deepened gradually, naturally. They worked side by side during the day, sharing the satisfaction of seeing her new home take shape. In the evenings, they often sat together on the porch of Virgil's cabin, talking about their pasts, their hopes for the future, or sometimes simply enjoying a comfortable silence as the Texas sunset painted the sky in vibrant hues. Martha, observing their blossoming romance with undisguised approval, tactfully began to make herself scarce in the evenings, claiming a suddenly increased workload at her own home. "You don't have to leave on our account," Faith protested one evening as Martha prepared to depart unusually early. "Of course I do," Martha replied with a wink. "Three's a crowd, as they say, and I've no desire to play chaperone to a pair of grown adults. Besides," she added more seriously, "it does my heart good to see Virgil so happy. You're good for him, Faith." By the end of June, the cabin was nearly complete. It was a simple structure, but solidly built and thoughtfully designed. The main room was larger than Faith had initially envisioned, with windows positioned to capture the breeze and the morning light. The stone fireplace dominated one wall, promising warmth during the cooler months. The small bedroom was cozy rather than cramped, and the lean-to kitchen had been expanded to include space for a proper table and chairs. "It's beautiful," Faith said as she and Virgil stood in the main room, surveying the nearly finished interior. "Better than I could have imagined." "It still needs furnishings," Virgil pointed out, always practical. "But Martha's been collecting items from folks in town, a table from the Wilsons, chairs from the pastor's wife, a bed frame from Harold Finch's brother, who's moving to California. The generosity of everyone has been overwhelming," Faith said, touched anew by the community's support. "I don't know how I'll ever repay it." "You already have," Virgil assured her. "By being the kind of person others want to help, by working alongside everyone instead of just accepting charity, by showing such courage in the face of adversity." Faith felt her cheeks warm at his praise. "You give me too much credit." "Not enough, if anything," Virgil replied with a smile. He hesitated, then added, "There's something I've been meaning to ask you." Faith's heart skipped a beat at his serious tone. "Yes, this cabin," Virgil began, gesturing around them, "it's built for one person. Comfortable for one, but it could be cramped for more." Faith wasn't sure where he was going with this. "I suppose so, though it seems quite spacious to me after losing everything." Virgil nodded, seeming to choose his words carefully. "What I'm trying to say, perhaps not very well, is that I've been thinking about the future. Our future, if you're willing to consider it." Faith's pulse quickened. "I am," she said softly. Encouraged, Virgil continued, "Then I wonder if we might discuss the possibility of expanding this cabin at some point, or perhaps building something new on the boundary between your land and mine, a home that would be ours." The implication was clear, and Faith felt a surge of emotion, joy, anticipation, a touch of lingering apprehension. "Virgil, are you asking?" He stepped closer, taking her hands in his. "I'm asking if you might consider becoming my wife, Faith Collins. Not right away if you're not ready, but someday. I love you and I want to build a life with you." Tears welled in Faith's eyes, happy tears that blurred her vision as she looked up at him. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, Virgil, I would be honored to become your wife, and I don't need more time. These past months have shown me everything I need to know about you, about us." Virgil's face broke into a smile of such pure joy that Faith's breath caught. He lifted her hands to his lips, kissing them reverently. "You've made me the happiest man in Texas," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "And you've given me back something I thought I had lost forever," Faith replied. "Hope, a future, love." Their kiss was tender at first, then deepening with the promise of all they would share in the years to come. When they finally pulled apart, both were breathing quickly, their faces flushed with emotion and desire. "When?" Virgil asked simply. Faith considered the question. "Soon," she decided. "Perhaps once the cabin is fully finished." "It would be a fitting closure to this chapter before we begin the next." Virgil nodded, his eyes never leaving hers. 2 weeks, then, if that suits you." 2 weeks, Faith agreed, her heart full to bursting with happiness. Word of their engagement spread quickly through Desdemona, met with widespread approval and congratulations. Martha was ecstatic, immediately throwing herself into planning a celebration worthy of the occasion. "Nothing too elaborate," Faith insisted when Martha began talking of inviting half the county. "Something simple with just our closest friends." "Simple but special," Martha agreed, already making lists of preparations. "You deserve a beautiful wedding day, Faith, even if it's not a grand affair." The final days before the wedding passed in a whirlwind of activity. The cabin was completed, furnished with a combination of new items, donations from townspeople, and a few pieces Virgil had crafted himself, including a beautiful rocking chair for the porch. "For quiet evenings," he explained when he presented it to Faith. "And perhaps, someday, for rocking a child to sleep." The idea of children, of building a family with Virgil, filled Faith with a deep, contented joy. It was something she had wanted with Thomas, but had been denied by his untimely death. Now, life was offering her another chance at that dream. On the morning of their wedding day, a Saturday in early July, with summer in full bloom across the Texas landscape, Faith stood in her new cabin, Martha helping her dress in a simple but elegant gown of pale blue. "Blue for fidelity and tranquility," Martha explained as she fastened the tiny buttons down the back. "And it matches Virgil's eyes, which I suspect is part of why you chose it." Faith smiled, not denying the observation. "Is it terribly obvious how much I love him?" "Only to anyone with eyes," Martha teased, giving Faith's shoulders a gentle squeeze. "But it's a beautiful thing to see, especially for those of us who have watched Virgil close himself off for so long." The ceremony was held on the rise near Faith's new cabin, under a clear blue sky with a gentle breeze stirring the wildflowers that dotted the surrounding grassland. Pastor Mitchell officiated, his words simple but profound as he spoke of love's power to heal and renew, to transform loss into hope. Virgil, standing tall and handsome in his best suit, his usually unruly hair tamed for the occasion, looked at Faith with such adoration that she felt herself glowing with happiness. When they exchanged their vows, his voice was steady and sure, his promise to love, honor, and cherish her ringing with sincerity. "With this ring I thee wed," Faith said in turn, sliding a simple gold band onto Virgil's finger, "and pledge to you my faith and my love for all the days of my life." "I now pronounce you husband and wife," Pastor Mitchell declared, beaming at them. "What God has joined together, let no man put asunder." The small gathering of friends erupted in cheers and applause as Virgil drew Faith into his arms for their first kiss as a married couple. It was a moment of pure joy, untainted by the sorrows of the past, full of promise for the future they would build together. The celebration that followed was indeed simple, but filled with warmth and genuine goodwill. Tables had been set up near the cabin, laden with food contributed by various townspeople. There was music. Harold Finch's son Jacob played the fiddle, while another neighbor brought his guitar and dancing under the open sky as afternoon turned to evening. Faith found herself taking a moment apart from the festivities, standing at the edge of the rise and looking out over the land that had once been hers alone, but was now part of something larger, a shared dream, a joint future with Virgil. From this vantage point, she could see the ruins of her old cabin in the distance, now mostly reclaimed by nature. The sight no longer filled her with despair. Instead, she felt a profound gratitude for the journey that had brought her to this moment, even the painful parts, even the losses. She sensed Virgil's approach before she saw him, recognizing his footsteps and then feeling the warmth of his presence beside her. "Happy, Mrs. Reed?" he asked softly, slipping an arm around her waist. Faith leaned into him, savoring the solid strength of him, the rightness of being at his side. "More than I can express," she replied honestly, "though it still feels strange to have a new name." "It suits you," Virgil said, "but what matters most is that we're together now, whatever names we use." Faith turned to face him, placing her hands on his chest and looking up into those remarkable blue eyes that had first captured her attention on that terrible day of the flood. "You believe in fate, Virgil?" she asked. "Or divine intervention, perhaps?" "Sometimes I wonder if the flood, for all its destruction, was meant to bring us together." Virgil considered the question seriously, as was his way. "I don't know if I believe in predestination," he said finally. "But I do believe that good can come from even the darkest circumstances, if we're open to it. The flood took your home, but it led you to me. And now we'll build something new together, something stronger, something that can withstand whatever storms life sends our way." Faith smiled, her heart full of love for this thoughtful, steadfast man who had become her husband. "On higher ground," she murmured, echoing his earlier words about the location of her new cabin. "Yes," Virgil agreed, brushing a tender kiss against her forehead. "Literally and figuratively. Our life together will be built on higher ground, on mutual respect, shared dreams, and a love that grows stronger with each passing day." From the gathering behind them came the sounds of laughter and music, of community and celebration. Soon they would return to their guests, to the dancing and feasting that would continue until the stars emerged in the Texas sky. But for this moment, they stood together on the rise, looking out over the land that had witnessed both devastation and renewal, both loss and love. The flood had swept away Faith's home and all her things, but Virgil had built her a new one on higher ground. And in doing so, he had helped her build a new life, a life filled with promise, with purpose, and with a love as vast and enduring as the Texas horizon stretching out before them. As the sun began its descent, painting the landscape in gold and amber, Faith and Virgil turned back toward their wedding celebration, hand in hand, ready to begin the journey that would carry them forward together through all the seasons of their lives. In the years that followed, their love only deepened as they built their life together. True to Virgil's suggestion, they eventually constructed a larger home on the boundary between their properties, symbolically uniting their lands as they had united their lives. Virgil's horse breeding operation flourished, with Faith taking an active role in the business, discovering a natural affinity for the animals and a shrewd mind for the commercial aspects of breeding and selling. Together, they expanded the operation to become one of the most respected in the state, known for quality stock and fair dealing. The following spring brought their first child, a son they named Thomas Virgil Reed, honoring both the past and the present. 2 years later, a daughter joined their family, Lillian Martha Reed, followed by another son, Samuel James Reed. 3 years after that, their home became known throughout the county for its warmth and hospitality. The devastating flood that had once threatened to destroy Faith's life had instead set her on a path to greater happiness than she could have imagined. With Virgil by her side, she had not only rebuilt her home on higher ground but had elevated her entire existence to new heights of love, purpose, and joy. And sometimes, on quiet evenings as they sat together on their porch watching the Texas sunset, Faith would take Virgil's hand and whisper a simple thank you for the man who had rescued her from more than just floodwaters, who had saved her from despair, and showed her that even after the most devastating losses, new love and new life were possible, especially when built on higher ground.